The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, which was already wrong. Winifred had learned to distrust Wednesdays. Nothing good had ever been arranged on a Wednesday. Not her father's will, not the letter from the solicitor, not the morning she had stood in the front hall of Ashbourne Park and watched her stepmother direct the removal of her mother's portrait from the east staircase. That had been a Wednesday too. She had counted the days afterward, just to be certain. The invitation was addressed to Miss Winifred Colton. Not Miss Winifred Ashbourne, not even Miss Winifred, which would have been rude but at least honest. Miss Winifred Colton, as though her mother's name had never existed, as though the woman who had planted every rose in the south garden and chosen every piece of china in the dining room and died quietly in the blue bedroom upstairs, had simply been erased from the record. She read the invitation twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table, which was where she ate now, and poured herself a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold. The Duke of Aldenmere was hosting a formal dinner at Whitmore Hall, 3 weeks from Thursday. All persons of standing in the county were invited, which apparently included her stepmother, Mrs. Colton, and by extension the 2 daughters Mrs. Colton had brought into the marriage, and, by no extension whatsoever, Winifred herself. She had not been mentioned. She had been written around, like a word someone had decided not to use. The estate, technically, still carried her name. Her father had been careless in a particular way that men of his generation sometimes were. Careless with paperwork, careless with trusts, careful about honor and entirely negligent about the legal mechanisms that were supposed to protect it. He had died leaving everything to his wife for the duration of her life, which had seemed reasonable at the time because everyone had assumed the wife in question would be Winifred's mother. It had not occurred to him, apparently, that he might remarry. It had not occurred to him to put any of this in writing with sufficient precision to protect his daughter if he did. The solicitor had explained it to Winifred in a voice that suggested he found the situation unfortunate but not personally actionable. She had sat across from him in his office in town and listened to him explain that she had, in effect, no legal claim on anything in that house. Not the china, not the portraits, not the roses, not her own bedroom, which Mrs. Colton had already converted to a sitting room for her youngest daughter. Winifred had thanked him and walked back to the cottage at the edge of the property that had once housed the gamekeeper. And she had sat there for approximately 40 minutes before she understood what she was going to do. She was going to go to Whitmore Hall. Not as Winifred Ashbourne, because that name would be known. Not as a guest, because she had not been invited. She was going to go as what she had technically been made. A woman of no particular consequence, a Miss Colton, a person who might plausibly be engaged as a household assistant for the duration of a formal week-long dinner party, because large houses with large guest lists always needed additional hands, and she had known since childhood exactly how to manage silver and for 40 and the logistics of a dinner for 40. She had not, at any point in her life, expected to use this knowledge to infiltrate her father's former patron's estate. But then she had not expected a great many things. She wrote to Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper at Whitmore Hall, whose name she knew from 3 years of county correspondence when her father had still been alive. She wrote as Miss W. Colton, temporary domestic assistant, available for the season, highly recommended, references available on request. She did not specify what she was a reference for, exactly, and Mrs. Hartwell did not ask. She received a reply within 5 days. She packed a single trunk and told no one where she was going. Whitmore Hall was larger than she remembered from the outside and considerably more organized on the inside. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was better than a Wednesday, and was shown immediately to the servants' quarters by a young footman who introduced himself as James and seemed primarily concerned with whether she had eaten breakfast. She had not. He arranged something. She was grateful in a way she didn't know how to express, so she thanked him formally, and he looked startled, as though he wasn't used to it. Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of perhaps 60, with the kind of quiet authority that comes not from title, but from having run a house of this size for 30 years without ever losing her composure. She shook Winifred's hand briskly and told her she would be responsible for the East Wing guest rooms and the linen press and, when occasion required, the arrangement of the private dining room. "The Duke is particular about the private dining room, Mrs. Hartwell said, in a tone that communicated clearly she meant particular and not difficult, though both were probably true. Winifred said she understood. "He notices things," Mrs. Hartwell added, and looked at Winifred for a moment in a way that was either assessing or simply direct. "Most employers don't. His Grace does." Winifred filed this away and said nothing. The first 2 days passed quietly. She learned the geography of the house, which was extensive, and the geography of the staff, which was more complicated. There was a cook named Mrs. Brent who had opinions about butter that she shared freely. There was a lady's maid called Annie, who was anxious in a pleasant sort of way. There were 3 other temporary staff brought in for the dinner week, none of whom seemed particularly interested in her, which suited her entirely. She did not see the Duke. She heard him. The house had the particular acoustic quality of old stone and high ceilings, and voices carried in ways that surprised her sometimes. She heard him twice in conversation, once with his land steward in the corridor outside the library, once in what she assumed was his study, where he appeared to be disagreeing with someone about a drainage issue on the East Field with a thoroughness that suggested he knew exactly what he was talking about. His voice was not what she had expected. It was not the indolent drawl of the county dinner table. He spoke as though words were instruments, and he had learned to use them precisely. She thought about this more than was useful. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Colton arrived. Winifred had known she would come. The invitation had been general, and Mrs. Colton had never missed a social occasion of this magnitude in all the years Winifred had known her. She arrived in a hired carriage with her 2 daughters, Miss Augusta Colton and Miss Frederica Colton, both of whom were dressed in colors that would have been lovely on someone else, and were perfectly acceptable on them. Winifred was in the corridor when they came in. She was carrying a stack of pressed napkins and was technically invisible, which was to say she was staff, and therefore no one looked at her. Mrs. Colton did not look at her. Augusta did not look at her. Frederica glanced in her direction and then immediately looked away, the way people look away from things they are not interested in. Winifred breathed slowly and continued to the dining room. She had expected this moment to be worse. She had rehearsed it in the cottage on enough sleepless nights that she had developed a kind of emotional callus around it. Not numbness exactly, but distance. The anger was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It had simply become useful rather than overwhelming, which was the only way she knew how to carry it. She set the napkins on the table and counted them, and moved 3 inches to the left and decided they were correctly placed. The dinner that evening was for 12, the Duke's closest neighbors and most immediate guests, with the larger party not arriving until the following day. Winifred was not required to serve, but she was required to be available, and so she stood at the side of the room while Mrs. Hartwell oversaw the proceedings and the guests arranged themselves. The Duke came in last. This was apparently his habit. She had heard this from Annie, who had heard it from the previous lady's maid, who had noted that His Grace was never late exactly, but always arrived as the last of his guests sat down, which created a particular kind of attention without being ostentatious about it. He was taller than she had pictured from his voice. He had the bearing of someone who had grown up knowing that rooms would arrange themselves around him and had decided, somewhere along the way, to be slightly self-conscious about this, rather than simply accepting it. He greeted his guests by name, remembered details about each of them, asked questions that suggested he had actually listened the last time he spoke to them. She watched him the way she had been watching everything in this house, carefully, quietly, from a position that made her effectively absent. His eyes moved across the room once, quickly, in the way of someone who has learned to read a space before settling into it. For one moment, they landed on her, not on the napkins, not on the sideboard, on her. Then Mrs. Colton said something charming and laughing to the woman beside her, and the Duke's attention moved to his guests, and Winifred looked at the floor. Her heart was doing something she considered professionally inappropriate. She addressed it sternly, and it did not listen. The complication arrived in the form of a letter. It came not for her but for Mrs. Colton, delivered on the 5th morning by the house's own postboy. Winifred would not have known about it except that she was making up the east bedroom at the time. Mrs. Colton's bedroom, as it happened, Mrs. Colton having been assigned the largest of the guest rooms because she had written ahead to request it, and Mrs. Colton's maid had left the door open, and Mrs. Colton herself was reading the letter aloud to Augusta with a satisfaction that was not quiet. "She says he has begun to make inquiries," Mrs. Colton said, "about the Ashbourne title." Augusta said, "Has he? It is the natural course of things. A duke of his position. He will want to understand the county's holdings and Winifred." "Winifred," Mrs. Colton said, with the particular inflection she used for the name, which was the inflection of something placed somewhere inconvenient, "is not a consideration. The Ashbourne name is mine to speak for now." Her father saw to that. There was a pause. "She is still in the county," Augusta said. "She is in a cottage," Mrs. Colton said. "Somewhere. She has made no effort to contest anything." Another pause. "She knows better." Winifred stood on the other side of the wall and held a pillowcase and did not breathe. She did not know better. She had simply not yet known how. This, it occurred to her now, this was how. If the Duke was making inquiries about the Ashbourne holdings, he would want accurate information. He would speak to the land steward, certainly. He might speak to the solicitor. He might also, given the kind of man he appeared to be, want to speak to someone with direct knowledge of the estate that she had grown up in, the estate she knew by heart. She had not come here with a plan beyond presence. She had told herself it was enough to be here, to see, to understand whether anything could be recovered. But plans, she had learned, rarely survived contact with the actual territory. You had to adjust. She finished making the bed with the same precision she always used. Then she went downstairs and asked Mrs. Hartwell whether the Duke would be requiring anyone to assist with the arrangement of the estate documents that had been mentioned for review that afternoon. Mrs. Hartwell looked at her. "He has his secretary for that," she said. "Of course," Winifred said. "I only mention it because I have some familiarity with county estate records, my previous position." Mrs. Hartwell continued to look at her with the steady gaze of someone who has learned when something is happening beneath the surface of a conversation. "I'll ask," she said finally, and went. Winifred waited in the corridor and tried to appear as though she were simply standing there for no particular reason, which was difficult. Mrs. Hartwell came back and said the Duke would see her at 2. His study was a room that had been used seriously. That was the first thing she noticed. Not decorated, used. The books on the shelves had been read. The maps on the table had been marked and remarked. The chair behind the desk had a small repair on the armrest that could have been replaced but hadn't been because function had been preferred over appearance. She stood in front of the desk, and the Duke did not look up immediately. He was reading something. She waited. You said you have familiarity with county estate records, he said, still reading. Yes, Your Grace. Which county? Which estate? Ashbourne Park, she said. He looked up. He was younger than she had expected from his voice and older than she'd expected from his reputation. There were 7 or 8 years between them, she estimated, which meant he had inherited young and had learned to carry it without it becoming a performance. His eyes were the gray-blue of winter sky, and they were looking at her with a directness she found she had not prepared for. The Ashbourne estate, he said. Yes, Your Grace. You worked there. I grew up there, she said, and then stopped, and understood that she had gone slightly further than intended. There was a silence that lasted precisely long enough for her to consider her options, which were limited. Your Grace, she said carefully, I should perhaps clarify my position. I think, he said. That would be useful. She told him. Not everything, not the cottage, not the Wednesday the portrait came down, not the particular way her stepmother said her name. She told him the legal facts, which were straightforward and verifiable, and which she had memorized because they were the shape of what had happened to her. She told him that she was Winifred Ashbourne, that the estate had been her father's, that she had no current legal standing to claim it, and that she had come here as staff because she needed to understand whether there was any path forward, and this had been the one available to her. She said all of this standing in front of his desk, with her hands at her sides, and her voice entirely level. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual in her experience. When she had finished, there was another silence. Then he said, Mrs. Hartwell hired you. Yes, Your Grace, as a domestic assistant. Yes, Your Grace, and you have been. He paused, making beds and managing the linen press and the East Wing guest rooms, while Mrs. Colton is staying in the East Wing. Yes, Your Grace. He looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking, which was itself unusual. She had generally found that she could read people, had learned to read them from years of watching a household that operated through implication. But his face was not a household. It was a study, as used and serious as the room itself. Sit down, he said. She sat. He asked her about the Ashbourne estate. Not in the way she had feared, not with the manner of someone about to dismiss her, but in the way of someone conducting an inquiry they had not known they needed to conduct. He asked about the acreage, the tenants, the drainage in the East Field. She had heard him correctly. He did know the East Field had a drainage problem, and he had apparently been trying to understand it from the county maps without the relevant local knowledge. He asked about the solicitor. He asked about the terms of the will. She answered all of it. She had always known these things. They had simply been waiting in her, accumulating, for someone to ask. At some point, she stopped thinking of him as the Duke of Aldenmere and started thinking of him as the person sitting across the desk who was listening to her with his whole attention. She had not had that in some time. You should have come forward, he said when she had finished. Someone would have. No one knew, she said, more sharply than she intended. No one asked. No one in this county has asked where I am in 18 months. I was made small and I stayed small, and everyone found it very convenient. There was a pause. She heard herself. I apologize, she said. Your Grace, don't, he said. You're right. She looked at him. You're right, he repeated more quietly. I didn't ask. I've been making inquiries about the Ashbourne holdings through documents and solicitors, and I didn't ask where the daughter was. He was still looking at her with that directness, which had not changed, and she understood now that it wasn't impersonal. It was simply what honest attention looked like on a person who had learned not to look away. The dinner the following evening was the large one. All 38 guests, the full formality of the occasion, the kind of evening where everything was arranged to be seen and admired, and the social calculations of the county would be conducted in plain sight over the fish course. Mrs. Colton was seated 4 chairs down from the Duke. Winifred knew this because she had seen the placement cards. She had not arranged them. That had been Mrs. Hartwell and the house secretary. But she had moved through the room when it was empty, and she had read every card and stood for a moment at the head of the table and thought about her mother, who had arranged tables like this one, who had counted chairs and adjusted flowers and known the name of every person who would sit at them. She served that evening, not as the lead, but she was present, and she was good at it in the way you are good at things that are in your blood, quietly, without being noticed, but precisely. Mrs. Colton did not notice her. Augusta did not notice her. The Duke noticed her. He did not look at her often, and when he did, it was briefly. But it was the same directness as the study, haute attention, and she found it hard to be invisible in a room where someone was looking for her specifically. Mrs. Colton laughed about something and leaned toward the Duke and touched his arm in that particular way she had, proprietary without justification. "We do so, Miss Ashbourne Park," she said, loudly enough that the neighbors could hear. It was such a responsibility, but one is glad to carry it for dear Edmund's memory. The Duke turned his head slightly and looked at Mrs. Colton for a moment. He said. It was not an agreement. It was not a disagreement. It was the sound a person makes when they are choosing not to say what they are thinking. Winifred, pouring water 3 chairs down, understood exactly what was happening in his face because she had been reading his face for 5 days and she had learned it. He knew, or he was beginning to know, and by tomorrow morning he would know completely, and he had no intention of letting Mrs. Colton understand this yet. She poured the water very steadily. Was nothing like she had imagined it. The confrontation was, she had imagined a scene. Drama in the public rooms, a revelation over the dessert course, some moment of exposure that would restore her name to her publicly, and leave Mrs. Colton standing in front of witnesses, with nowhere to go. She had imagined it, partly because it would have been satisfying, and partly because it was the shape of stories like hers, and she had been telling herself a story for 18 months to keep herself moving. What actually happened was that the Duke's secretary came to find her in the linen press on the second-to-last morning. He handed her a note, waited for her to read it, and then said that the Duke's solicitor was arriving that afternoon, and that the Duke would like her to be present at the meeting. She read the note. Then she read it again. "He has retained counsel on your behalf," the secretary said, carefully neutral. "He believes there are grounds to examine the terms of the Ashbourne Trust." She stood in the linen press with the note in her hand and said nothing. "Miss Ashbourne," the secretary said, and she registered that he had used her right name, which meant the Duke had used it, which meant it was known in this house now. "The Duke would like me to convey that he is sorry it took this long for anyone to look." She folded the note. She did not cry. She was not made of the kind of material that cries in linen presses, and she had made a point of being more structurally sound than that for long enough that it had become true. But she stood there for a moment and let the weight of 18 months rest somewhere other than on her own spine, and she breathed. "Please tell His Grace," she said, "that I will be there." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Mrs. Colton was not present, but she became aware of it, and the awareness moved through the house in the way things move through old houses, through walls, through small adjustments in the behavior of servants, through the careful quiet of a building that knows something has shifted. By the time the solicitor departed, Augusta had found a reason to be near the main stairs. Frederica had developed a headache. Mrs. Colton herself sat in the rose parlor with her embroidery, and a composure that was, Winifred thought, rather impressive under the circumstances. The grounds, as it turned out, were not small. Her father had made a second amendment to the trust that had been incorrectly recorded. Not maliciously, the solicitor thought, but through the particular administrative negligence of a man who trusted that things would be handled and did not check to be certain. The amendment, properly interpreted, created protections for any natural children of the marriage. The solicitor, who had handled the original estate and who appeared to feel some professional embarrassment about the oversight, was now prepared to examine this with considerably more thoroughness than he had shown previously. None of this was resolved by afternoon. These things, the Duke told her afterward, take time. She had found him in the corridor outside the library, which was where she had first heard his voice, the first day, through stone walls. He was alone. The house was quiet in the way of late afternoon, when the light changed and the guests were dressing for supper, and everything paused for an hour. "It isn't settled," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the question is now formally open, which is different from where it was yesterday." "Where it was yesterday," she said, "was nowhere." "Yes." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she had not seen there before, which was the specific uncertainty of a person who has something to say and is not sure they have the right to say it. She found she recognized it because she had worn it herself fairly recently. "I want to ask you something." She waited. "When this is concluded," he said, "however it concludes, I would like to continue speaking with you." He paused, and for the first time she saw him searching for a word the way she sometimes searched for one, not as a householder and a domestic assistant, as something else. She looked at him for a moment. He was looking back at her with the same directness she had first noticed and had never entirely recovered from. The attention that saw rather than assessed, the kind that assumed you were worth the trouble of knowing. She thought about her mother's portrait, taken down from the east staircase, about 18 months in a gamekeeper's cottage, about Wednesday mornings, about poured water at 38-person dinner tables and linen presses, and the particular loneliness of being invisible inside your own history. Then she thought about the way he had said the question is now formally open, as though her existence was a question that had simply been waiting for someone to make it official. "As something else," she repeated. "Yes," he said. She considered it. He let her. He did not fill the silence with assurances or arguments, and she understood that this was itself a thing to trust, the patience of a person who had learned that silence was not the same as absence. "Then I would like that as well," she said. The light in the corridor had gone golden with the late afternoon, which in old houses made everything look like a painting of itself. Winifred stood in it and felt for the first time in 18 months like someone who was standing in the right place. Not as a guest, not as staff, not as a name someone had decided to write around, as herself, present and accounted for, and exactly where she had always belonged.